Good evening, all. Thank you for taking your time to attend this session of Wellbe Wednesdays. Today's session is all about building resilience. So it's even more need. It's a need for the art today. As building resilience, we all go through failure, and various scenarios in life, especially COVID has taken us through a lot of it's been a roller coaster ride last year, and we've started a fresh year, and I really look forward in listening to Dr. Suresh, understanding how we could build resilience. This program is brought to you by Wellbe Work in association with IIP. I'll just give you a brief about Wellbe Work. Wellbe Work is an organization that focuses on mental and social well-being of individuals and individuals in organization. We offer employee assistance program through assessments and confidential counseling services that addresses personal, professional, and familial issues. As a part of our program, we offer workshops and webinars to create awareness. Okay, this is what we do in the mental well-being space. And as a part of this effort, we conduct this Wellbe Wednesdays event on the last Wednesdays of every month. So I would like to now ask Mr. Manikandan to introduce about IIP and the speaker of the day, Mr. Dr. Suresh Kumar. Manikandan, please take.
Yeah, thanks, Diwakar. Thanks. Good evening, and once again, warm welcome to everyone present over here. I'm pleased to say a few words about the International Institute of Psychotherapy. IIP is a first of its kind and has been established by a multidisciplinary team of mental health professionals, including psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and social workers in India. It is to be a forerunner in the field of psychotherapy. Bhatmi Vibhushan Professor Dr. M. Sharada Menon is the founding patron of IIP. IIP's mission is to make available evidence-based psychotherapy intervention, research, training, and education that are built on best available clinical evidence to promote optimal functioning of individuals across the lifespan. For more information, please feel free to visit our web portal. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Manikandan, please introduce Dr. Suresh.
Sure, Diwakar. And once again, it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker of the day, Dr. M. Suresh Kumar. He is a service provider, teacher, trainer, researcher, and international consultant in mental health and substance abuse. He is a recipient of Albert H. Humphrey Fellow in Substance Use, which is in Johns Hopkins University in USA. During his tenure at UNODC, WHO, and UNAIDS, doctors assisted substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and intervention across 15 countries. Doctor has published several articles in international journals, and he is also an editorial board member of the International Journal of Drug Policy. It is an honor to have you, Dr. Suresh, and I request you to deliver the webinar on building resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me first thank Wellbe and IIP, and particularly I want to be grateful to Tad Alfonso for asking me to be here and join you on this Wednesday. I'm very grateful to all of you for being present. It's a working day. It's not even the work time is over, and I'm sure can you just give me permission to share the screen? If the host can give me permission to. Okay.
I've made it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Today, this evening, I'm told for the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to take you through what I call as building resilience. As Devaka was mentioning in the beginning, we are in unprecedented times. COVID is not just an ordinary pandemic. I am 66 and I haven't seen anything very close to this pandemic ever. And the response to the pandemic has even been worse than the pandemic itself, whether it's in terms of lockdowns, the panic that prevailed among the people, then the complacency that sets in, and then the resurgence and the recurrence of the virus. So it's a huge disaster situation all of us has faced. It's not just a health impact. It also had a great economic impact on the lives of people. Many people lost their jobs. Many people, have to migrate to different places. So we have faced very difficult situations. So in adverse situations like this, we really need to be bold, resilient, and importantly, hopeful. How do we do that? That's going to be my presentation. As an outline, I really want to talk about stress because fundamental to everything is stress. I want to provide an overview. I'll slightly take a different viewpoint on providing an overview about the stress and the stress response system, because understanding of that is very important for us to negotiate with that. And I also want to emphasize there are different kinds of life stressors that we go through. Very important one would be early life stress. People who face stressors very early on tend to have more problems, more adverse impact later on. So I'll talk a little bit about early life stress. And I think more than acute stress, chronic stress is more important. A pandemic lasting for 12 months, or a problem that is lasting for a long period of time, an interpersonal issue. Chronic stress is always problematic. And stress can impact on physical and mental health and lead to diseases. Lastly, I think the most important thing of today is how do we actually resolve these stress-related issues and how, as human beings, we can build resilience before I conclude. So that will be biggest kind of an outline I'm going to provide you, but I'll walk you through this. First and foremost, let's talk about stress. That's a very commonly used and often abused term. When I was a student in the 60s, in the school and in the college, the only term that I know of about stress is in the physics subject. I never thought of stress as a psychological issue when I was growing up. We never used stress as an ordinary parlance in our discussions in school when I was growing up. Today, I think everybody talks about stress, right from a kindergarten child to a very old man. Everybody talks about stress and stress. Even though it's a subject of study for a long period of time, it's become a very popular topic only these days. As I said, a term that came from physics, and I think largely used now in psychological settings. I think physicists have actually forgotten about stress. They need to find a different name so people don't get confused. I've shown the photograph of two very important people to me who have been pioneers in our understanding relating to stress. This is Walter Cannon and Hans Selye. These two important individuals have contributed a lot, which is actually making relevance even till today. Walter Cannon, way back in 1915, about more than 100 years ago, he came up with this fight-flight response, which we still hold on to. Whenever a person is facing stress, there are only three things people do. Either they fly away, they escape from the problem, or they get frightened and get frozen and don't make a move, or some very nice people fight it out, cope with it better. So flight, fright, fight is usually the response that stress leads to. And I think we should be having the ability to fight rather than to run away, rather than to get frightened. Walter Cannon thought about it even a century ago. He also coined a term called homeostasis, which is very popular in medical circles, which means getting the equilibrium back to normalcy. That means you disturb the body and its equilibrium. The body has a tendency to restore its equilibrium. So we're all engineered in a way that we can achieve homeostasis even in adversities. Hans Selye, he came up with the concept of what we call as general adaptation syndrome, which later on called as a stress response. He talked about stress response in 1936, which is still very valid. He talked about there is a stress, there is an alarm phase, and then there is this resistance phase, and then there is an exhaustion phase. He talked about the stress response. In order to understand stress, I think we need to identify certain words and remember it. We use a word called stressor. By definition, a stressor is the one which triggers a stress response. Anything that can trigger a stress response will be called as a stressor. The stress response is actually generated in the brain. The brain has to perceive something as a potential threat. Unless the brain perceives something as a potential threat, there will be no response. So the perception to the stress is very critical. And it is dependent on a variety of factors, a combination of factors. It is related to the duration of the stressor. It is related to the intensity of the stressor. If the intensity of the stressor is very high, or if the duration is longer, then the brain perceives it as stress. This perception of stress varies from individual to individual. I'll give you an example. Back in the 2000s, 2004 to be precise, when tsunami struck the Indian Ocean, I was holidaying. I didn't even know that there was a tsunami. Few days back when I resumed contact with the outer world and I got my connections, I understood there's a tsunami which hit including Chennai. I became guilty. I rushed back to the city. I want to do some work. I went to a fishing hamlet called MGR Thittu near Kadalur, which is an island. Me and my wife, we thought as psychiatrists, we'll be able to provide psychological support to these people who've been victims of tsunami, who lost a lot of lives, lost their boats, lost their lives. We thought we could go and help them. When we went there, we were surprised that the so-called post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't very prevalent among this fishing community. They were much more resilient in dealing with the problem. Me and my wife were more stressed living in that fishing hamlet, not knowing how to live in a fishing hamlet for the first time in our life. So we were actually perceiving more stress than the people who've been affected. So the perception of the stress can vary across individuals, and a relatively innocuous stimuli for someone could be a threat for someone else. So you can't ridicule somebody and say, why are you relating to this relationship as a big issue? Why are you reacting to the failure like this? Why are you reacting to a failure in the examination like this? You can't dismiss off. I think the individual's perception is extremely critical. Second, I think we need to understand the stress performance connection. This connection is very important. For people who are at work, they do know. If you're working in a computer industry, for example, your team leader is going to put a lot of pressure on you. Is that bad? Is that negative? Or if you're a student, the teacher is going to put a lot of pressure on the student. Is it good? Is it bad? What is that? I think if there is absolutely no stress or low stress, the performance is going to be very low. If the stress is optimal and moderate, the performance is going to be the best. An examination going student, if he's not mildly stressed or moderately stressed, he's not going to open up the book and read it, and so he's not going to perform well. All the high achievers and performers actually are mildly to moderately stressed or optimally stressed in order to perform better. It's always that inverted U-shaped curve. So when the stress level increases, the performance increases. But if it goes beyond optimal level of stress, that's when the disorganization happens and people become very anxious and disorganized, and people's performance miserably goes down. So high levels of stress certainly has a negative impact on the performance, whereas moderate level of stress is going to be good for people. So that is something that you should be aware. Then there is something called positive stress. As I said, there are certain positive stress. This moderate, short-lived stress responses, like a boxer before going into the ring, he is hyper. He's moderately, stressed, and then his heart is pumping. His heart rate is little increased, and the stress hormones is increased. that's when he can actually participate in the competition and win the, ring. Otherwise, he's going to be a big loser. So also, when you are meeting a new challenge, when you're meeting with a frustrating situation, or even getting an immunization shot, these are all positive stress. And I think this is very important. Positive stress is extremely important for a healthy development. So you can't really have a life devoid of stress. If you are going to be having completely a state of nirvana, where absolutely there is no stress, you can only be a sadhu and certainly not be a functional individual. So in the context of a stable and a supportive relationship, I think for a healthy development, positive stress is certainly required. So some amount of pressure is really required for people. And there is something called tolerable stress. What is tolerable stress? Tolerable stress is a stress that is actually capable of disrupting the brain architecture, but it is buffered by very supportive relationship. And that's exactly what happened in, the tsunami. When I went to the fishing hamlet, I found, how is it they are not disturbed so much? They had this extended family concept. The whole village is one. The whole village is connected, either by blood or by friendship or kinship. Even if I lost a son or a daughter, my sister's daughter is there. My brother's son is there. That's enough for me. So that kind of a supportive relationship, bonding, and a facilitative adaptive coping certainly helps the people to have a buffering effect. So this is exactly the reason why people can still survive bereavement. Like somebody loses a loved one, or the person is facing a divorce, or facing some job loss, still they don't give up. It lasts for a time-limited period. The brain is able to recover because the opportunities to recover from the damaging effect to the brain is always there, and that is called tolerable stress. The critical factor here is the supportive relationship and a facilitative adaptive coping, and it's usually lasting for only a shorter period of time. Okay, then what is this toxic stress, which I think all of us get worried about? Toxic stress actually happens when there is no buffering, when there is no protection, when there is no support. So suddenly realize it's not just having a stress. The stress, I think we can deal with it, but the support is not there. The buffering support is not there. That's when I think it could become toxic. The stress can disrupt the brain architecture, and the stress management systems are functioning at the lowest threshold. And I think then there is this increased possibility of both physical and mental health issues. So toxic stress is something where the individual's architecture is affected in the absence of a buffering system, so much so the stress management system is not really functioning well, leading to physical and mental health problems. So positive stress is good, tolerable stress is okay. I think the toxic stress is the one we should be worried about. So what is the stress response system? As I said, many structures in the brain are responsible for the stress management. So we call the whole structure that is there in the brain as a stress system. Can we actually mute people and the host mute people in the background? So there's so much of a noise. I'm sorry about that. You can mute all the people. It'll be very helpful. Thank you. So hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So the stress system is very, very important. And the stress system is situated within the brain. And I think whole lot of brain structures are very important in contributing to the stress system. Their main business is to detect whether an event that is occurring is really potentially threatful. So it identifies whether a given event that's happening in the environment is a stressor or not. So for that, I think the brain differentiates between physiological stressors versus psychological stressors. The way brain processes physical stressors is slightly different from the way brain processes psychological stressors. For example, okay, this is the brain stress system that I was talking about. The brain processes the psychological stressors in a slightly different way compared to physical stressors. The psychological stressors go through what we call as hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's a very important system. And I think whereas the physical stressor is going through a sympathetic adrenomedullary axis system. So fundamentally, the way the brain processes physical stress is slightly different from the way brain processes the psychological stress. Then there is this common pathway which leads to both behavioral and physiological changes. Often the whole idea of the stress response is to make the body to adapt to it. Only when the adaptation fails, I think the people have problems. So the normal functioning of the brain is to somehow adapt to the stress, and we are structured for that. Okay. Also, I want to tell you, I think the brain today, we understand the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology of stress a lot better than when I was studying medicine in the 1970s. So I want to simplify to the non-medical audience here. If you can look at brain as upstates and downstates. The upstates is the cortex, the newly developed area of the brain. The downstates is the area which has developed from the primitive ages. For example, you've seen a reptile. Have you seen a reptile which is very relaxed and happy? The reptile is always very anxious. The thinking in reptile is only one. Will I eat what is in front of me, or will the one in front of me is going to eat me? It's all about survival. So such kind of a reptile brain is in the downstates of our brain too. And the structures like amygdala are the ones which are responsible for these emotions. So all of us have this primitive reptile brain in us, which becomes very active during periods of anxiety and stress. Whereas the upstates is the one which gives us the hope, the resilience, the coping, the ability to cognitively think and process and arrest it. So all our psychotherapists are trying to use the upstates to control the downstates. The downstates is very active when the stress is there, and we need to activate the upstates in order to control the downstates. As simple as that. The cortical area of the brain is the one we need to really activate, and that's the one which is responsible for coping, for adapting, for positively relating, for the resilience, for being hopeful, whereas the downstates is the one which provokes us to become very stressful and anxious. So fundamentally, I think the neuroanatomy of the stress has been very well understood. Also remember, fundamentally, there is a difference in the brain between men and women. Unfortunately, women experience more stress during lifetime than men. If you ask women, women would say it's always and often because of men. It is the men who give them the stress, the extra stress they're undergoing. So women undergo more stress compared to men. That is why some of the stress-related disorders, including anxiety and depression, is more prevalent in women than in men. They are not directly responsible for that because they're given a large share of stressors compared to men, both physiological and psychological. But the brain, the way it can adapt to the stress, give out the same amount of stress that the women have to the men will not cope with it, will die of it. Whereas the women are still resilient, are able to cope with these stressors. That is because the brain is slightly different in men and women. Look at the women, they have larger volumes in the frontal and medial paralimbic cortices, whereas men have larger volumes in the downstates, like in the amygdala and hypothalamus. That's one of the reasons when men are faced with stress, they simply cannot cope with it very well. And the women can actually cope with stress, even though they are given a large load of stress in life. So that's the fundamental difference between men and women, which is also explained by brain. Let me now move on. We talked about what is stressor. We talked about what is positive stress and tolerable stress and toxic stress. We talked about the stress response system, which is there in the brain. We said how the brain is responsible for processing psychological and physiological stressors in a different way. Now we'll move on and say, how do we actually give importance to early life stress? Why is early life stress so very important? I think we know the brain is the one which is getting orchestrated, like to the stress. across lifespan. When you are a child, when you are very young, when you are exposed to stressful events, this can trigger many changes. This has a long-lasting effect. What happens as a child, a stressful event, can have a long-lasting effect as an adult. Many adults who are indulging in maladaptive responses have a background in their early childhood. So it's very important for us not to make this early life stress for our younger children. Children who are exposed to stress during critical periods of development, even while the child is inside the womb, when the mother is going through, let's say, maternal depression, for example, that could be extremely stressful for the child which is growing inside, or when the child is just born and the child is exposed to very many stress factors, both physical and psychological stressful factors, and I think that could have a long-lasting effect. This affects what we call as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the mediating one for developing a lot of psychological issues later on. So it releases the corticosteroids from the adrenal glands in a very cascading way. That is something which is very dangerous and toxic to the growing brain. So early life stress is always not good. So all of us should try to help young children not to go through early life stress. Chronic stress is another important thing that's extremely important, because if an individual is going to go through long-term stress, what we call as chronic stress, it is actually going to alter the DNA methylome and chromatin compaction state. So that means genetic transcription itself is changed. And the genetic transcription is changed in important functions like in mood and pain perception. So if you have people whom you know who have chronic stress, let's say the husband and wife have a very poor interpersonal relationship, enduring marital discord. These are the people who are more prone for mood disorders like depression. And these are the people who, when they have pain, they cannot tolerate pain. A lot of people complaining about pain, and the pain is not responding to the usual medication. The physician will say, I think you need to see a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Your pain seems to be not getting modulated by our physical treatments. Long-lasting stress, chronic stress can actually alter pain perception. So mood and pain perception are two very important functions that are affected because of the gene transcription changes that take place in chronic stress. So chronic stress is very important. And the stress can actually produce multiple physical problems. Cardiovascular diseases are extremely important, because if a younger person is having a heart attack, a younger person in the 40s, before the age of 50, if somebody has a cardiovascular incident, early onset cardiovascular incident is always related to two factors. Either it is to lifestyle like smoking or stress, a stress-related disorder, or a combination of it. A combination of it is bad. You've seen people at the age of 30 developing a heart attack, 40 developing a heart attack. Now, why would they develop? Why has Ganguly developed a heart attack? Obviously, he must be going through a whole lot of stress related to other people. I think this stress is an extremely important factor, I think, compared to many other people. So younger people that go through stress and stress-related disorders, they are more likely to have cardiovascular diseases. And then we need to talk about gut and brain signaling. I think gut and brain are completely connected. Gut is called as the second brain. And I think the second brain is very, very important, because the gut microbes are very important in controlling the brain. So the microbiome in the gut is really responsible for a good brain development. So I think there is a strong relationship between gut and the brain. Gut is called as the second brain. So the stress and GI system can produce a lot of problems. GI tract, movement disorders, and then irritable bowel syndrome. And I think people having, lots of gastrointestinal problems, all related to stressful factors. Ask a gastroenterologist. Many of the gastroenterologists will tell you stress is one of the important factors which contribute to gastroenterological problems. Also, people who are exposed to chronic stress have an increased risk of developing autoimmune disorders. I think this is proven by studies. Autoimmune disorders are extremely common. We talk about psychological disorders a lot of psychological disorders could probably be, related to, stressful factors, whether it's an adjustment problem, whether it's alcohol and drug abuse, whether it is anxiety, it's a behavioral problems, depression, eating disorders, sexual disorders, sleep disorders, suicidal behavior, all of them could be related to stress and adverse circumstances. So many of the psychological problems are related to stress. Now come back and talk a little bit about how do you actually resolve stress-related problems. Having known what stress can do and how stress can have impact on the, body and the mind, we also have to understand how to resolve stress-related factors. The first and foremost is how do we actually restructure our cognition? I think a lot of these people tend to magnify the problems. So maximizing their own weaknesses, maximizing some of the problems that they have is one of the things that happens with these individuals. So we need to restructure their cognition by telling them and reflecting to them. They may be magnifying the problem, or they may not be aware even of the strengths that they have, the potentials that they have. So they may be minimizing their strengths, minimizing their accomplishments, minimizing their achievements. And people may just be focusing on negative rather than on positive factors. And people can indulge in this black or white phenomena. People can tend to say it's black or white, rather than knowing that many things are gray in life. So generalization is the other issue that happens with people. I had a failed attempt. Obviously, I'm going to be a failure. That kind of a generalization. And these are people who make feelings as facts. I feel bad. You are only feeling bad. I turn it as a belief and say, I am bad. So making the feelings and turning the feelings into facts is another important thing people do. So cognitively, we need to restructure all these issues. Second, I think we need to help people to solve the problems. People have to understand problem-solving techniques. For that, we need to go through some simple steps. We need to define the problem, brainstorm all possible solutions. Maybe if not together with friends and other people, you can do that, brainstorm. Focus your energy and attention to be able to complete your task. Identify the outcomes related to various solutions and weigh it and see what is the best. Take a decision and carry it out. Also have an alternate plan. Always have an alternate plan. If one solution is not working out, that's not the end of the road. We can always look at an alternate plan and then evaluate the outcome. Such kind of a problem-solving strategies is going to be important. Another important strategy to deal with stress is relaxation exercise. I think relaxation exercise is fundamentally critical to all of us. Breathing exercise, simple diaphragmatic breathing, breathing slowly and deeply, primarily driven from the abdomen, is the best breathing exercise. If somebody is going to be indulging in breathing exercise for 15 to 20 minutes on a consistent basis, this person, man or woman, is going to be relaxed most of the time. So doing very simple things can actually solve very complex issues like stressful situations. So breathing exercise is strongly recommended. And people also suggest something like progressive muscle relaxation. Psychologists will teach you the Jacobson's progressive muscle relaxation technique. Here, instead of trying to control the mind directly, you try to make the muscles to get relaxed, because muscle tension is equivalent to mind tension. Muscle relaxation is equivalent to mind relaxation. If you really want to relax the mind, instead of relaxing the mind directly, you relax the muscles. Automatically, if you learn to know how to relax the muscles, the mind also will become relaxed, because these two are mutually, incompatible, muscle tension and mind relaxation. So that's a simple principle. Or using imagery, that's very important. Close your eyes. Imagine a very beautiful thing. Things that have happened fantastic in your life. And imagine your pet, playing with a pet in a nice park in the best possible way. That's the kind of imagery that's going to relax you. I think in all this, whether it is a breathing exercise, whether it's a muscle relaxation exercise, whether it's the use of imagery, the mantra is doing it regularly. You can't do it for a few days and claim success. The key is regular practice. Consistency is the most important. I also want to tell and emphasize how important sleep is. Sleep hygiene is extremely important. This is often turning around to be a very sleepless world. You'll be a lot of people in the society today aren't sleeping either adequately or in proper times. They sleep, but not in proper time. They're actually messing up with their circadian rhythm. So sleep hygiene is fundamentally important in order to be resilient. First of all, reduce and limit the caffeine and nicotine, the stimulant that you're taking. If you're a cigarette smoker, if you're going to smoke about 20 cigarettes a day, there is no way you can be, like relaxed. That's going to be making your wired brain very, very alert and anxious. So reduce your quantity of nicotine. Don't drink caffeine a lot. So reducing caffeine and nicotine is extremely critical. Avoiding alcohol closer to the bedtime is extremely important because, alcohol can also, in a mild quantity, can be a stimulant. You can be awake and blabbering something. And then, it's not the right time to do it. And maintaining consistent life routines and sleep-wake schedules, meal times, and exercise times are very important. I think the life routine, those who lead a disciplined life always have a better health. I have a professor who's my mentor who just wrote to me yesterday, you know what? I get up at 3:30 every day in the morning. That's where my day begins. Professor Peter Fernandez, I worship him for the simple reason. He's 88 years young. He's so disciplined. I think it's very, very important. We need to draw lessons from such kind of people, how important it is to maintain a good life routine. Also, eating a light bedtime snack is very important. Drinking hot milk and having a peanut butter, these kind of things. Environment is very important. Having a proper light, noise, and temperature within your sleeping room. I think these days, a lot of these bedrooms have their attached television. If you hook onto this television late in the night, an anchor is speaking at such a loud decibel, 10 times more than me, shouting at you and shouting at the audience. I don't think it's a great place for you to sleep. So obviously it's going to be very annoying and not going to be, like a peaceful night sleep. So I think keeping your light very subdued, noise at a lower level, and a comfortable temperature are all critical for sleep hygiene. And I think very important tip is go to bed only when you're sleepy. And you remember, bed is only for only two purposes, to have sleep and to have sex, and no other activity in the bed. You can't be going to bed and thinking about what am I going to do next day, plan to do tomorrow, things to do tomorrow. You'll only be a thinker in the bed. So don't want to do that. You want to associate bed with sleep. And I think once you are not sleepy, just get out of the bed, come to the sofa in the hall and start reading something heavy and probably feel sleepy, go back and sleep. So whatever time that you slept, doesn't matter. Wake up at the same time. If 6 o'clock is your waking up time, do get up 6 o'clock consistently. Don't tell today I haven't slept. I had to compensate till 9 o'clock I'll sleep. Don't do that. Do not sleep during the daytime. Avoid daytime naps. I think one of the ways of improving sleep is sleep restriction. That is, the amount of time asleep in the percentage of time in the bed is very, very important. So make people to sleep only in bed, and when they don't sleep, they should get up. And then we have to restrict the time of, not just rolling around bed and being restless in bed. I think we need to wake them up consistently at the same time in the morning, no matter what it is. If you keep doing it, the rhythm also gets back to normalcy. Are there any tips to build resilience in order to cope with stressors better, adverse situations better? By definition, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, quickly from adversity. It denotes their mental toughness. Some people are inherently born with that. I told you about the fishing folk. They are inherently resilient. And the people who lead a very tough life, and they are better resilient than most people are. I think we have to really learn lessons from them. What is that makes them mentally tough? What is that makes them to recover quickly from adversities and difficulties? How is that they are able to face failures much better than others? What are the things that people can do is to increase the physical activity. We know the best vaccine for the brain and the mind is a good physical activity. A good physical activity is not only going to ensure a good physical health, but importantly, good mental health. So any advice from the mental health practitioner to remain mentally healthy is to increase the physical activity. whether it is an aerobic exercise, participating in sports, or now being heavily promoted yoga, it doesn't matter. All are very important. All physical activities really are helpful in improving mental health. The mantra is at least 30 minutes of physical activity for 5 days a week. We are talking about 150 minutes per week. If you can do it consistently for a long period of time, you are surely assured of a good brain health. So 150 minutes is what I'm requesting from people's time. Mood regulation is very important. I think the state of the mind is often determined by the moods that you are in. If you're in a happy mood, you're enjoying the moment, you're doing very many good things. If you're in a negative mood, you're going to be leading to misguided decisions, unhappiness, and low self-esteem. So I think the moods are very important. This is how the normal mood is. The normal mood itself has fluctuations. Nobody has a constant mood of one thing. It's like the road going right and left. But I think that's a normal range. So mostly people have this normal mood changes. Unfortunate people dip very lowly and then they experience depression. So we need to regulate mood. Positive mental health is extremely important. In order to have a good positive mental health, you need to have a good attitude towards yourself. You have to appreciate yourself. Do not expect you to be appreciated by others. It's not times where people are there to appreciate you. You should be the one to tell you, I am good. I am okay. I am fine. I am wonderful. I'm doing great. And I think this is something that we need to learn from the Westerners. Westerners keep saying that I'm very good. I'm very strong in this. I'm pretty good at that. Indians play it down. They in the name of humility, they say, I don't know. Others have to praise him. I think we need to really say, I love myself. I am okay. I'm fine. The attitude towards the self is very important. Not boasting oneself. Understanding, acknowledging one's own strength is very important. I think all of us have to realize we are all capable of growth. We're all capable of development. We all can go into this Maslow's actualization scale. And all have to strive for autonomy and independence. I think life, human beings' life is to achieve autonomy and to achieve independence. Can't be dependent on people all the time. We need people, but we need to also be independent. The perception of reality is very important. We must understand the real from unreal, the real threat from unreal threat. We can't be carried out by unnecessary things. Today, a lot of the perceptual changes are happening in reality, mainly because of unnecessary rumors. For example, the reality relating to COVID vaccination is distorted by WhatsApp rumors. Vaccination is so important, so relevant, so vital. But how does people don't even understand that reality? The perception gets altered mainly because of rumors. I think a positive mental health comes by right perception of reality. We need to master the environment. The environment cannot dictate over us. We should be able to master the environment. The environment will keep changing. It is dynamic. We need to adapt to it. And I think we need to indulge in healthy mental mechanisms. Humor is one thing. The humor on self is the most important one. And I think there are laughing clubs in the city and people go there just to laugh in the parks. And I think it's very important. Humor is a very important way of keeping yourself mentally healthy. Altruism, very important. The power of helping others, the power of being of support to others is very important. We need to inculcate it from very young. And I think we really have to, also anticipate certain things and then, plan for it. So these are all very important. I want to point out about humor because humor actually produces changes at the hormones. There is a hormone called 5-hydroxytryptamine 1A and oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone. This is the one which makes us to bond with others. If you are able to have a better bonding relationship. Oxytocin is secreted well in women. That's one of the reasons, even in stress, they will go and relate to people. They are the ones who join the women's self-help groups. They are the ones who go and talk to the neighbor and talk about it. Men are very, very secretive. They don't want to talk about it. The oxytocin level is very, very important. It makes people to bond with each other. Everyone can develop a sense of humor. It's not as though that some people are humorous by nature. Everybody can develop it. It could be affective humor. It could be self-enhancing humor. It could be aggressive humor. It could be self-defeating humor. But you need to really, that humor on self is very good. I think humor really, really helps you to change the internal locus of control. Lastly, I also want to say that self-esteem increase is very, very important. You need to face your fears head on. You need to forget your failures. I wish there is an eraser in the brain. The computers have a delete button, but the brain doesn't have a delete button. It can have only an ignore button. We need to ignore our failures. We need to push our failures into the past. Really have to understand what you want in life. You need to be very assertive. Otherwise, you'll just be taken for granted by people. You need to reward yourself when you are successful. Even others are not rewarding you. You need to reward yourself. Do not make comparison with others. This is a very bad Indian habit. We always compare ourselves with neighbors, with friends and colleagues, and then down ourselves. Or our parents do it, our friends do it. Never ever compare with others. We are unique individuals. Each one is uniquely good in his own way. Don't assume all of that you know. There's nothing wrong in asking. I always ask people, ask. We don't know, ask. There's nothing wrong about it. You don't have to know everything about everything. It's not possible. Even the question and answer session, when people ask me something, I sometimes say, I don't know the answer. You may call it an expert. I don't know. Maybe I'll learn about it tomorrow and then come back to you. So saying that is not very, very important. And also remember, in life, alternatives work. There is no one way. There is many ways. I think if there is many roads to enter, there are many roads to exit also. So there are alternatives may work. And then positive suggestions are important. And I think people can indulge in auto suggestions, saying that, I can do it successfully, I'll do it well. Such kind of positive suggestions are important. I also believe very strongly, maybe it's not because of my background, where I studied, where I came from, where I've been ingrained so much in school and in college. I think I'm a strong believer of spirituality. I'm not so much into religiosity. I don't mind people belonging to any religion, any faith, it doesn't matter. But I think the fundamental to the whole thing is the spirituality. You need to understand the meaning and purpose of life. That's critical. I was told right from very young days in my Don Bosco institution, I think we as individuals have to find a purpose in life, have to find a meaning in life. And I think that's the most valuable lesson I've learned from my school. I owe everything that I've been today to my school teachers, to the people who taught me the fundamental value of life. What is a purpose? When I was an 8th grader, my Tamil teacher came and told me, he asked me to stand up. Maria Joseph. He asked me, what's the purpose of life, Suresh? Why are you born? I never even thought about it. As an 8th grader, he made me to think. He didn't turn me into a Gautama, but I think he turned me into a person to always look back and introspect, which is very meaningful. So finding a purpose in life is very important. And I think the search for the infinite and sacred, including whether it's a religiosity, whatever is important. But I think hope is integral to life. All of us, human beings, have to be hopeful. Hope is the most important aspect of life. And I think we need to really understand the meaning of reactions to limits of life. Everything is not under our control. When illness strikes you, when people stuck with COVID, when people stuck with certain illnesses like cancer or with certain adversities, they ask, why me? Why me? There is no answer to it. As a doctor, I always say, there is always a limit to life. That's all you know. You admit to that. You surrender to God. That you believe in spirituality, you better come off it. So to give very few simple tips as improving resilience, I would say, in my opinion, the deep breathing exercise is important. Also bring in meditation. Doesn't matter what religion you belong to. All religions teach you the principles of meditation. Being with yourself for that particular time is very, very helpful. Visualization, visual imagery can also be extremely, useful. Practicing gratitude. I should be grateful in life to all those people who taught me, who gave me this, who did this to me, who helped me when I was in that situation. That's very important. Practicing gratitude. How do we thank? Do we thank our mother? Do we thank our fathers? Do we thank our teachers? Do we thank our neighbors? Do we thank our friends? Do we thank our children? This is very important. I think practicing gratitude is a very important one. Journaling is also another important factor. I think journaling, not necessarily the bad things, journaling good things. I always tell my clients, journal good things that have happened in your life. You keep it. You'll really enjoy it someday later when there is a tough day. And creative activities, indulging in creative activities could also be improving your resilience. These are some of the simple tips that all of us can do. I dropped this sunflower. I'm always, fond of a sunflower. And I put some examples of what I said in one box, and people can fill up their own boxes into the leaves and come up and say, this is what I need to do in order to remain resilient. And I think I want to end by saying stress is ubiquitous and it's going to follow us everywhere. All people will never be having a situation where we'll have no stress in life. And I think we can mitigate and adapt to stress. That's still possible for us. Two very important stressors that are important is early life stress and chronic stress, because these are the ones which lead to problems. But the good thing is it is possible to manage stress and to improve resilience. We can keep our brain healthy by remaining resilient and hopeful. Thank you so much. I know it's taken a long time than I wanted to, but I hope there'll be some time for the question and answers. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Doctor?
Yes.
Doctor, that was thanks for the wonderful presentation, Doctor.
Thank you.
Participant, this is the time for question and answer session. Please post your questions in the chat box. Doctor will answer according to his time.
Did I not show the slides fully? Because there is a chat which says that wasn't she seen till the end, the screen?
It was visible. It was visible. Yeah. Thank you.
Doctor, there was a feedback from one of the participants by name Meera Ramesh. She says it was scintillating delivery and a wonderful session.
Thank you, Meera. Thank you for generous words. I think I'd appreciate some questions. I'll be happy to take some feedback from you. Thank you so much for the compliments. I don't know whether it's worth it, but I think I enjoyed being here.
Doctor, there's a question from Ms. Kirti.
Yeah.
She's asking, what is actualization?
See, this is the original concept of Maslow. I don't know, I've heard of the person called Maslow. He says, usually human beings are wired away. We are looking for some very basic things in life. You can't go and talk about self-actualization to a starving human being living in poverty. For him, getting the next food is the most vital thing. So I think all of us as human beings have to fill up our basic instincts, whether it is food, whether it is sex, whether it is a shelter. Those are fundamental to life. Once you do that, and the man will say, all I need is just a food to eat and a place to live. I'll be very happy. Once you give it to him, he's not going to be happy. Then he'll say, I want more. You want to go to the next level. And give him that, he'll say, I want more. And you give him that, so the pyramid keeps building. And finally, then he will go into the state of self-actualization, where this is exactly what few people manage to achieve. Like people like Gautama Buddha achieved it, like that self-actualization by getting into a state of nirvana and say, this is life for me. So people can actually reach their own levels of self-actualization. In whatever profession you are in, whatever thing that you are in, as a mother, the mother's self-actualization would be to make sure that I actually bring forth my children with values. I really want my children to be honest, humble, and helpful. And I think if that's the mother's dream, I think she has self-actualized herself. As a professional doctor, if I'm going to be saying as an attitude, I really want to help people. That's my job, not to make money. If I want to make money, I could probably become a broker in something else, or I become a real estate guy. Why should I be a doctor? I think I am a doctor mainly because I want to help people. Money is not my driving force. Money is incidental. But I think that kind of a thing. So everybody needs to bring on to that actualization level. To what level one has to self-actualization. That's exactly what Maslow's concept was. I think, so are stress and memory related? Fantastic question. Fantastic question. Because you see, if you're a teacher or if you're a mother, and then people come back and tell you, I am not able to remember anything. I am I read a lot, doctor, but I don't remember the exam. When I go to the examination, I fail completely. So there is a great relationship between memory and stress. Please look at the brain. I'm always fond of the brain because it's all understandable. In the brain, in the downstates, there are two areas. One is called amygdala, other is called hippocampus. The amygdala is the one which is responsible for emotion, and hippocampus is the one which is responsible for the memory. They are very close to each other. They are inseparable cousins. So when you're going to load the amygdala with so much of a stress, oh, exam, I will fail. My teacher will fail me. I never passed last exam. Physics, I've always failed. This time also I may fail in physics. If I have that kind of attitude and work up a stress, what I'm going to read, it knocks on the hippocampus. It's not even going to register. So it's not going to get registered. High stress is going to impact on your attention and on your registration, and so your memory will not be intact. So obviously the answer is yes. One of the ways to improve memory is to make you to feel very relaxed. So a stressed child, at the same time, no stress, you will not even open the book and read. That's why I said optimal stress is very important for a good performance, for a good memory. And when the performance becomes knocked off, when the stress becomes very high, when it becomes disruptive. Okay. So then there is also.
Yes, doctor. Thank you, doctor. But there's another question from Tad.
That's a very good question on what is the minimum duration for sleep. That's one of the most difficult questions to answer, Johnson, because it is very individualized. Generally, people will say 6 to 8 hours is what is required for an adult. However you define that adult, 6 to 8 hours. As age advances, the hours of sleep comes down. Older people sleep less. I used to sleep a lot then at 66 now. I sleep less than what I used to sleep in the 40s. Young children sleep a lot. Older people sleep very less. Adults have to sleep between 6 to 8 hours. What is important is the quality of sleep, not just the duration of sleep. When you get up in the morning, you need to feel afresh. You have to feel that you had a good night's sleep, that you rested very well. So that's very important. So that can only happen if you maintain the circadian rhythm. You can't go to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, get up at 10 and say I slept for 7 hours, but then your quality of sleep may not be that good. So you need to really follow the biological clock and sleep well. 6 to 8 hours. And then there is something called afternoon nap. A lot of cultures do believe in afternoon naps. You go to Spain, Portugal, China, people sleep in the afternoon for a short period of time. That short nap is rejuvenating. And that is usually lasting over about 30 minutes and not more than that. If you are going to sleep more than 30 minutes, like you'll become like a Kumbhakarna, you are really going to be very tired and not going to be very rejuvenated. So sleep is a very important one. So stress women generally comparatively, okay.
There's a question from Tad.
Yep.
Doctor?
Yes.
There's a question from Tad. He's asking, is there a gender difference in building resilience? If so, what it is?
I think, no, I answered two questions together. There's also this question from Redmi, who I don't know the person, but says stress in women generally experience comparatively more. Is there a difference? Okay. First of all, I told you two important statements. There are two separate statements that we read together. One is, in terms of stressful events, women face more stressful events than men. That is due to multitude of factors. First and foremost, they have this more physiological stressors, which is related to the reproductive cycle. The cycle of, menstruation, the cycle of pregnancy, the cycle of childbirth, and then the menopause. This whole cycles brings on an additional stress to them, which is physiological in nature. And then they face more familial stressors and interpersonal stressors relative to men. So basically, the stressors faced by women is much more than men. That is why there are more stress-related problems, including depression. Okay, it's 2 times more than men when it comes compared to prevalence of anxiety and depression, almost in many cultures. But the ability to deal with stress is slightly different. Women can deal with stress, which means their resilience to deal with stress is better than with men. Simply because of one important factor, because they have a tendency to find supportive relationships. You form a support group. The men won't attend to it regularly. The women would go. More than AA people going to the AA meeting, the Alcoholic Anonymous people, like all AA alcoholics going to the AA meetings, the Al-Anon group people will be very sincere going there because the women need more support. The self-help groups for women, extremely successful. Women would bond with the neighbors and friends and talk about their problems somehow or other. So I think this bonding, which is inherently attached to a biological phenomena called oxytocin, which is easily secreted in the brains of the women, is probably the responsible factor why they are much better in stress coping. That's why they escape it also. Men don't have that. That's a biological difference. I said brain volume wise also there is a difference. Certain volumes in the brain also are helpful in making the women to better deal with it. So that's the sexual difference in the way people can respond to the stress. So you see, why is that we feel, Kriti is asking, sometimes we feel bad in mood without any reason. Why this happens? Right. I told you emotions, when I say emotions, there are three components. Component one is emotional reward. That is, you do something very interesting, nice, and somebody rewards you. Like Meena told me today, oh, that's a scintillating talk. My mood is supposed to be very good because it's a reward she's given me and she's appreciated me. So it reinforces me, makes me feel better. That's called emotional reward processing. Then there is a second aspect called internal mood. No reason. The mood is coming from within. The mood coming from within is a very autonomic process. And that is a slightly different part of the brain which is responsible, which is the medial, internal part of the prefrontal cortex is the one which is responsible for that kind of a internal regulation of the mood. There, I get up in the morning some days with a fine mood. I get up in the morning some days with a very bad mood. That's completely decided by the part of the brain, which is the inner part of the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the cortex. And then there is this lateral part of the brain, which is connected to the environment. Something good happens in the environment, and I feel very happy. And I think I'm regulated by what happens in an environment. That's combined. So there are three emotional parts. One is related to the environment, one is internal, one is reward related. So there are three different things. So you can feel good or bad for no reason from within. That's entirely decided by your brain network issues. So I think for some people who are suffering from depressive disorder, for no reason they feel sad. And that's what happens in people like major depressive disorder, with the lived experience of major depressive disorder. They come and tell you, I am everything happening well. Everybody say, I want to be in your shoes, but still I feel miserable. So it is entirely to do with their internal neural networks, internal neurochemicals. So I think that's the one you need to understand. I feel tense if I try to relax. Why is it so? Because you're focused so much on feeling relaxed. And I think you need to take your mind off. And that's one of the reasons trying to control mind through the mind is not possible for everybody. If you tell the brain, I don't want to think about anything, the brain starts to think more in some people. That's why meditation is not possible for everybody. That is why the Russians came up with the concept of muscle relaxation. They said it's not possible for us to relax the brain straight away. Why don't you control the brain through the muscles? It's easier to relax the muscles rather than the brain. So control the muscles, relax the muscles. When the muscles are relaxed, the brain gets automatically relaxed. That'll be your answer. So you need to do muscle relaxation rather than going for a meditation. It all depends who can do what. A spiritual writer once wrote, we need to move from self-actualization to move to self-transcendent spirituality for a greater growth. Father, you are the best judge. I think you need to educate that. I completely understand that. I think, what you're saying makes complete sense to me. I think not everybody is capable of that greater growth. I think we all go to certain levels. People like you ascend to such great levels because you're all devoted to spirituality all through your life. And we worship you. We adore you for that. I think, thank you so much for sharing with us, Father. Why a child should long-term compare than when a child should sleep longer than, okay. Why a child should, I think it's biology. So biology indicates that the children require more rest. The newborn children sleep most of the time, no? Otherwise, the mother cannot cope with that probably. God knows that, the mother needs also rest. The child is going to be awake 18 hours. The mother will be completely, put to so much. I think the children sleep, they need. I think the biological mechanism is such that the children require a lot of sleep in order to develop their functions well. Yeah. Any question I missed, Manikandan?
Doctor, yes, doctor. We missed Tap's question, I believe.
No, I think he has already answered.
Okay, okay.
Doctor has already answered with comparing with other question already.
Doctor, there's a final question from Mr. Johnson Joe.
Yeah.
He's asking, like, he is 51 years young. Oh, okay, 15 years young, and to wake up 3:30 a.m. on regularly, by what time? Like, he's asking to wake up at 3:30 a.m. What time you should go for bed?
No, Johnson, you are only 51 years young. I'm 66 years young, and I'm still not getting up at 3:30. I said my mentor, Dr. Peter Fernandez, actually Dr. Sharda Menon was our guru. She's the one, the founder of IIP, is the one who actually taught me psychiatry. But then at that time, we had Dr. Peter Fernandez, Dr. Sharda Menon, Dr. V. Ramchandran, and all that stalwarts, guiding us. Dr. Peter Fernandez, I'm still in love with him for the simple reason he's one of the most disciplined persons. And I really worship him. Every single day, I communicate with him because he's a source of inspiration to me. He's 88 years old. He tells me he gets up at 3:30. He plays 1.5 hours of table tennis every day. And he spends some time with the pet. Everything is structured in his life. I wish I can be half like him. I'll be very proud of myself. And I can't do that. So if you want to wake up like Peter Fernandez at 3:30 in the morning, at least you should start sleeping by 9 o'clock in the night. I don't know whether your family will ever permit you to do that because that's a busy family time for most of the people. So you need to get to bed around 9 o'clock in order to get at 3:30. I think a lot of people, reasonable time would be around 5 to 6. I think we are all living in a very difficult time. Those days, I think people got up regularly my mother gets up regularly by 4:30. That's been by nature. Forever, I know her, she gets up at 4:30. I had never got up in my whole life at 4:30. I'm very ashamed about that. So there could be fundamental differences. But at the same time, I think 5 to 6 is not a bad time. Yeah. Right. Thank you. I really want to thank all of you. It's been a wonderful audience, very stimulating audience. And I certainly appreciate all of you being there. I'm thankful to TAD, IIP, and Welby for having me here. I had an enjoyable evening. I hope we can meet sometime in real and not virtually like this, and I can discuss more. I think the real meetings will be more fun. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a time for now officially giving you thanks and thanking everybody here. So I take this opportunity now this is a time for expressing our sincere gratitude to all those who have been part of this endeavor. First of all, I express my gratitude to Dr. M. Suresh Kumar for the wonderful session on building resilience. I believe that we are all spellbound with this passion and got to learn a lot to become more resilient. And I sincerely hope that we would love to have more sessions from you, sir. And thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this webinar and to give us all this information. And you are always, you have been always inspiring, and you will continue to inspire. And our sincere prayers that you continue to have a better health. Yeah. So. And this webinar has been possible with the continuous support of the team members of WellBe and International Institute of Psychotherapy. And I express my sincere gratitude to the WellBe and IIP team members for putting all together to run this webinar series. And I especially thank all the participants who registered and have attended the session. We hope that you continue to participate in the future sessions too. I'm sorry if I have missed thanking anybody, and looking forward to the session scheduled on Wednesday, 24th February 2021, and you will get the details of the webinar soon. So thank you all once again, and good night to everybody.